Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining us for tonight's program. Before we get started, I wanted to thank the 30 or so libraries who are partnering with the Tewksbury Library tonight. And they are Andover, Billerica, Brewster, Canton, Carlisle, Dennis, Dracut, East Longmeadow, Fitchburg, Gardner, Groton, Hamilton, Wenham, Harvard, Lowell, Linfield, Mansfield, Milford, Nahant, Northborough, Norden, Salisbury, Scituate, Shutesbury, South Hadley, Stoneham, Swansea, Tewksbury, Waltham, and Whitman. So I sincerely apologize if I missed any, but I think I got them all. So very excited. Thank you all so much for joining us here tonight. And we're here tonight to hear from one of Massachusetts must-read authors, Nicholas Basbanes. Nicholas was recently recognized by the Massachusetts Center for the Book as one of Massachusetts must-read authors of the year. He is joining us here tonight for a presentation on his critically acclaimed book, Cross of Snow, A Life of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. And I'm actually shortchanging Nicholas. Not only was he recognized, but he was actually one of the finalists. He was one of the 3 finalists for Best Nonfiction Book written by a Massachusetts author last year. So congratulations, Nicholas. A little bit about the book. In Cross of Snow, the result of more than 12 years of research, including access to never before examined letters, diaries, journals, and notes, Nicholas reveals the life, the times, the work, and the soul of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, the man who shaped the literature of a new nation with his countless poems, sonnets, stories, essays, translations, and whose renown was so wide-reaching that his deep friendships included Charles Dickens, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Julia Ward Howe, and Oscar Wilde. So Nicholas, who's a Lowell native, is an award-winning investigative journalist and was literary editor of the Worcester Sunday Telegram. His articles have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Smithsonian, and many other publications. And he is the author of 8 books. Nicholas lives here in Massachusetts in North Grafton. And again, want to thank the 30 libraries for partnering for tonight's program. So everyone who's live on the call, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Nicholas for joining us here tonight. And Nicholas, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Okay, well, Robert, thank you for that fabulous introduction. 30 libraries, that's, it's humbling. Thank you. And thank to all the other people. Did you say Colorado, San Antonio, Texas, Florida? Thank you. Thank you for joining us. And thanks to the Massachusetts Center for the Book for recognizing Cross of Snow. This is a Massachusetts story, as it happens. It's also a New England story. It's an American story. And as you'll see as we get into it, it's an international story. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow was beloved not only here, but all over the world. And so I'm going to launch right into my PowerPoint, and then we'll have plenty of time for some questions afterwards. And here is, of course, tonight's program, a little logo with a tip of the hat. Thank you to the Massachusetts Center for the Book. Here's the dust jacket of the book, and I like to start with this, and I have my little Massachusetts book honor label on there, affixed just recently. That's the actual photo that we used, Julia Margaret Cameron, taken in 1868. I love this picture because it really depicts Henry Wadsworth Longfellow at the height of his fame and his celebrity. It was taken in England during what was almost like a victory lap for Henry Longfellow. He went on a European trip. It started in Great Britain, and he was received by Queen Victoria at Windsor Castle. He received honorary degrees from Oxford and Cambridge, and then they took a very casual trip through a number of countries in Europe. And everywhere he went, he was treated like royalty. He traveled with 11 members of his family. But what was interesting about this picture was taken on the Isle of Wight by Julia Margaret Cameron, one of the great portrait photographers of the day. He was brought there by Alfred Lord Tennyson, and he said, Miss Cameron, I'm leaving Mr. Longfellow with you. Take his picture. I'll be back. And quite splendid. And earlier that day, actually, not the same day, it might have been the same day, I think he was, actually, it was the same day when he went to see Dickens, but Queen Victoria welcomed him at Windsor Castle. And she wrote in her diary later that night how astounded she was to see the domestic staff taking vantage points, very subtle, almost hiding places to get a look at this famous poet who had come to visit her in the castle. And she was just astounded that everyone, the common folks, I hate to use that phrase, but everyone not only knew who this man was, but he was a true celebrity. So that's very important. He's arguably the best known American in the world at the time. I say this advisedly, more than any other public figure. And here he is at the height of his popularity again. You see him in the center. That's a reproduction of the bust that was made of him and is erected in Westminster Abbey in Poets' Corner. The only American to date, by the way, to have his bust entered into Westminster Abbey, Poets' Corner. The portrait at the right, George Peter Alexander Healy, that's at Bowdoin College, and there he is with his dog Trap. So this is the Longfellow as everybody knows him. Now, most everyone knows him. I point this out because the Longfellow I wanted to write about in Cross of Snow is not only the gentleman you just saw, but this gentleman you see right here. This is the Henry Wadsworth Longfellow as both his wives knew him. He was married twice. Both his wives died under very tragic circumstances, which really influenced not only his life, but the poetry that he wrote. And here he is. You see him on oil, on canvas and oil. You see him in a silhouette. You see him by Winslow Homer in a sketch. You see him in a photograph. You see him sculpted in stone on every imaginable surface. He has been preserved and already these are in the 1840s, but this is the Longfellow as both of his wives do. I'm often asked, why a book about Longfellow? Number one, I was very upset with the way he had been treated in the 20th century by critics. Really dismissed. I guess the modernists were unhappy with his 19th century poetry. Who knows what happened? There was this great movement, an iconoclastic movement, and Longfellow fell out of favor. That's all right. Poetry and writers, we come and go. Celebrity is a slippery slope. But in the very nasty way that he was treated, I thought that should be rectified and addressed. So there was that component. But even more so, I wanted to write a love story. I've written, as Robert mentioned, 8 books, and they're all works of nonfiction, cultural history. When do you get a chance to write a genuine, authentic love story? As the title of the book, Cross of Snow, which we will get to, indicates. So this is the Longfellow as both of his wives knew him. And this is the Longfellow as he was quite the clothes horse, by the way. And I write about that. You'll never see any photograph of him, or any painting where he is not impeccably dressed. And here are a couple of photographs that he took. And I just thought I'd put them in there. They're quite wonderful. The students at Harvard kind of made fun of him, too, playful fun. He knew about it, but they were always talking about his sartorial skills, and he wore very flashy clothes, European finery, Savile Row suits, European fashions. He was really very, very conscientious about his looks, and you see it in the pictures. Let's just start a little bit of background here. He's a child of New England. Very opening words in my first chapter is he was in love with his New England background, the fact that his grandfather, General Peleg Wadsworth, as you see in that silhouette there at the left, he was a Revolutionary War hero. He was charged with defending the District of Maine during the Revolutionary War. He stayed there after the Revolution, and he became a very prominent man in Maine politics. And this is the house on Congress Street where Henry was brought up. Now, he wasn't born there, but he moved there as a very young man. That house was built by Peleg, and then his parents moved in. And Henry's bedroom, I've been in there, is on the top floor on the left. It looked out at the coast. Longfellow is really quite unique among American writers, I should point out, because he has not one but 2 of his homes, which are National Historic landmarks and are museums well worth your visiting. This one up in Maine, the Wadsworth Longfellow House, and also, of course, the great Longfellow House in Cambridge on Brattle Street, which was so important and so influential in the writing of this book. Another reason why I was emboldened to do this book, is because of the great wealth of material that is kept there by the National Park Service. And I'll be getting into that a little bit later. But his grandfather was General Peleg Wadsworth. His father was Stephen Longfellow, who was a lawyer, a Portland lawyer, served a couple terms in Congress, and that's his mother. So he came from a very good family with good bloodlines. His father was a Harvard graduate. His grandfather on the other side was a Harvard graduate. Henry goes to Bowdoin College. We'll get to that in a bit. He was named for an uncle, Lieutenant Henry Wadsworth, who died in 1804 in the Battle of Tripoli. And a horrible incident. And he was 22 years old. He was a young junior officer in the Navy. And there was some sort of, I don't know what kind of a mission it was. Who knows? It was a horrible explosion. It was sort of a torpedo attack on one of the pirate vessels. And this is as it was depicted in a contemporary colored engraving of the time. But young Lieutenant Henry Wadsworth died tragically and heroically in that action. And the monument you see at the right is the very first military memorial erected in the United States. It was erected in 1806, 1807, Carrara marble, actually brought to the United States on old Ironsides, and it was in Washington, D.C. for many years, and during the Civil War it was moved to Annapolis, where it is today. So he was named for his uncle, Henry Wadsworth. Thus we have Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Henry entered Bowdoin College in Brunswick, Maine, not Harvard like both of his grandfathers and his father before him. It was a newly formed school, 1795, meant to be kind of a Harvard of the North. I went to Bates up in Maine, by the way. Bowdoin is our very big rival, very friendly rival. And here's a painting of the way it looked in 1823 or so when Henry arrived on campus as a 15-year-old sophomore. He had spent his freshman year at home being tutored, but he and his an older brother, Stephen, went to Bowdoin together in the same class. And Henry arrived on the Bowdoin campus already a published poet. This is very important. He always wanted to be a writer. His father wanted him to be a lawyer. His father said, we don't have independent wealth. You can't afford to live by your pen. And Henry decided that's something he wanted to do anyway. But when he arrived on the Bowdoin campus, he had already published poems, a number of poems in local newspapers, pseudonymously or under his initials, but he already knew the taste of publication, and he liked it. And while he was at Bowdoin, he excelled. He graduated fourth in his class. Among his classmates was his very good friend, Nathaniel Hawthorne. They consider the class of 1825 arguably one of the great college classes in collegiate history. Who's going to argue with them? On his graduation day in 1825, graduation day, commencement day, I've seen it in the minutes up at Bowdoin College, he was offered the position. The trustees met and they voted to create a professorship of modern languages. And only 3 other colleges in the United States taught them at that time: Harvard, William and Mary, and the University of Virginia. James Bowdoin's wife left a stipend to create this professorship, and they decided Henry Longfellow, who had proven himself quite brilliant at translation, they offered him the position. But first, he had to go to Europe at his own expense and learn the very languages he would be expected to teach. And his father, very sportingly, underwrote such a trip. And Henry left, and I write about this in my chapter I called Awakening. And this is where Henry really, I believe, the character of this man, the man he will become, is shaped in so many profound ways. He is arguably, I think, our very first multiculturalist. He embraced languages. He embraced not only languages, but he came to know Washington Irving when he was in Spain, in Madrid. He became part of the little circle there, and they embraced him. He was a very likable young man. And Irving told them, it's not enough to learn languages. You must learn and absorb the literatures. And this he did. And he also, these are self-portraits, by the way, and all of these I photographed out of the journals of his, which are at the Houghton Library at Harvard. And he's quite the talented artist, as you can see. And the picture on the far left, if you can see in the margin, he has Enrico. Well, that's how the Italians knew him, and Enrique as in Spain, and Henri in France. And there he is on the steed in Spain on the road to Malaga. He says, he quotes Byron. It was just a wonderful, wonderful sense of who he was and where he was traveling. And these journals are absolutely essential in learning him. he wrote home to his sisters, and he said he urged them, his sisters, to learn foreign languages. He says, for every language a person knows, another man he becomes, or another man or another woman. But he really urged his sisters to learn languages. He returned after 3 years to Bowdoin College, assumed his position. And here are, by the way, a couple of other examples from his travel journals. As you can see, he interleaves illustrations in there in Venice or in Spain. Illustrations. I photographed every page, by the way, of these hundreds of pages of journals at the Houghton Library, so you can see the strings up there. These are my photographs of some of these pages. But when he returned to Bowdoin, he took up with a young woman from his hometown of Portland, Mary Storer Potter. They were married, and by all accounts, they were very happy, and she was exceedingly happy on the Bowdoin campus, where he became this professor of modern languages. He translated from multiple traditions. If there were no texts, he prepared his own books. In fact, in the 6 or so years that he's at Bowdoin, he publishes 9 books, different translations, so he can teach them to his students. In one instance, he writes his publisher in Boston to send him sets of the page proofs from one of the text so he can pass them out immediately to his students. He will be credited, by the way, with introducing so many authors to American readers. Among German authors, Goethe and Schiller, he introduces those to American readers. He's one of the most important translators of Spanish and of Italian, as we'll see later when we get into the Dante translation. And he's also writing poetry, but he's also eager to, as he says, he loves it up in Maine. It's his home state. But as he writes to one of his friends, I'm not dead in Maine, but I'm kind of buried in Maine. And he was eager, after having traveled through all of Europe, to perform, as he said, on a larger stage. And then out of the blue, he is offered another position, the same teaching position at Harvard College, to replace the great George Tickner, who handpicks Henry to replace him. And he's offered the same basic terms that from Harvard that Bowdoin gave him, which is to come and teach these foreign languages and literatures. But first, he must go to Europe and learn another 6 languages. By the time he's done, he has mastered at least a dozen languages. His library in Craigie House, there are 12,000 books there in 45 different dialects and at least a dozen different languages, all of which we can assume he not only could read and translate, but read fluently. He spoke fluently in so many different languages. People would say he's amazing. He speaks German with the German. He speaks French with French people, or Italian with Italians. When the Emperor of Brazil, Dom Pedro II, visits him, they speak Portuguese. When Ole Bull, the violinist, comes, he speaks Norwegian. Just an amazing individual and very fluent in languages. And not only the languages, but the foreign cultures. He absorbs them. And that's one of the reasons why he really tries to assimilate a lot of European traditions in his own poetry, which he does, and for which a lot of people have criticized him, but that's a whole other story. So anyway, he sets off to Europe with his first wife, and tragically she dies 5 weeks or so after a miscarriage, and we really don't know much about the weeks leading up to it. They're very discreet about what they write in their journals, but we really don't even know that she was pregnant until right about the time she has the child, and she loses it. And Henry is totally distraught. And when he comes back to the United States, meanwhile, he soldiers on in Germany, and he figures he's going to continue his work before returning home. And before he goes back, he decides he needs some rest, and he goes off on an overland tour. And in Switzerland, he meets the daughter of Nathan Appleton of Lowell, Massachusetts, who was the founder of Lowell, Massachusetts, of Beacon Hill, who established Lowell, the textile mills there. And he just falls head over heels with this young woman. Meanwhile, they spend a few weeks traveling together. And Henry is invited to spend some time with them. He does. And he goes back and he takes up his position at Harvard. Here is Henry, his professor, contemporary paintings. The first one depicts him in his robes at Bowdoin, and here he is by Eastman Johnson when he was teaching at Harvard. And here is young Miss Frances Elizabeth Appleton Longfellow. As we said, she is the daughter of a very prominent Beacon Hill textile manufacturer, Nathan Appleton. And here she is, painted by George G.P.A. Healy in 1834. She's 17 years old. And there she is in Florence, sculpted by Lorenzo Bartolini. And there she is with her sister Mary on the right, is painted in Paris by Jean-Baptiste Isabey. And this particular painting hung for a while in the Louvre before it came back to the United States with the Appleton family. And not only was she beautiful and tall and rich, of course, which is another element, but she was brilliant, truly a brilliant young woman who embraced knowledge in every imaginable way that you could speak of. She herself spoke a half a dozen languages. She spoke her mind. She had her own her own thoughts on the issues of the day. And when Henry met her, he was totally dazzled. What he wanted more than anything else in the world was not only a woman that he could love and raise a family with, but a woman who he could share intellectual conversations with and reading. And he had finally basically met his equal. I have recently written an essay, which I hope will be published soon in a academic journal, but I call it Meeting of the Minds, the Intellectual Partnership of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and Fanny Appleton Longfellow. It was an amazing relationship when it finally developed, because actually she liked him. She was 18 years old at the time, and she had a life of her own to live, and as much as he was interested in pursuing this young woman, she was interested in remaining his friend. Henry returned to Cambridge. He started calling on the home of the Appletons on Beacon Street and Beacon Hill, and here are Nathan Appleton on the right, and Maria Theresa Gold Appleton is painted by Gilbert Stuart around 1806, and these paintings now also hang in Craigie House. And Fanny, as I mentioned, was not only a brilliant woman who spoke many languages herself. She was a talented artist, and I'm showing you here some of her sketches that she made during this very trip that she met Henry. Here is a sketch of the Colosseum, another of the... I actually traveled to these particular landmarks on the right at Paestum in Italy, outside of Naples, where she traveled, and I wanted to see that exact same scene that Fanny Appleton did, and she did a remarkable job. Here she is. This is probably the only self-portrait we have of Fanny, actually. This is in Naples, and she's doing that Castel dell'Ovo, and there she is, young Miss Appleton, on the right with her sketch pad at the ready. A remarkable young woman. While they were together in Germany, by the way, part of the courtship, and this is recorded in Henry's journal and also Fanny's journal, together they translated a ballad from German into English, and it was The Castle by the Sea by Uhland. And Henry later acknowledged that even though he is the man credited by multiple scholars for introducing so many German authors to American readers, that her translation was superior, of this particular poem was superior to his own, and it was her translation that he used in the book Hyperion. And here is Fanny's own handwritten version of that poem. She actually did two. There's one fair copy in the Houghton Library, and there's another at the Longfellow House. But what I love about this, as you will notice, she has basically written a little title page. She has the title in German, and then she has By the Sea by the German Uhland, but it's by Fanny E. Appleton and Henry W. Longfellow. She gives herself top billing. I think that's quite spectacular, and she knew how good she was. This is Beacon Hill, and this is a contemporary engraving, appeared in Greason's Pictorial, 1843, just about the very same time that Longfellow and Fanny Appleton, after 7 years, they were married. But this is kind of where their house was, at 39 Beacon Street. I can't really point out where their house is. I could point out the location, but I can't really identify the house itself from this particular picture. But this is a contemporary view of what it looked like. Henry would go into Boston on a regular basis from Cambridge, 4 miles. He'd either walk it or take the carriage, and he would call on the Appletons. And here's the way it looked, same scene in 1890 or so. And Boston Common. This was Betts Beacon Street off on the left, going up. Their magnificent townhouse looked out on Boston Common, and this was another contemporary scene actually from 1843 or so. And that is the home of the Appletons. It's a very rare photograph. There's only one that I could find in the historic New England collections that show the house with the 3 floors before a 4th was added. But that would be designed by Alexander Paris, by the way, and quite a beautiful home. It recently sold, by the way, for $16 million, so it retained its value, I would say. Quite a magnificent place, and this is where when Henry went in to call on Fanny, it would be at 39 Beacon Street in Boston, and this is the interior as it looked a little more than 100 years ago, while it was still on the ownership of the Appleton family. It later became the Boston Women's Club, and my wife and I had a chance to visit it while it was between owners, and quite magnificent. That's called a bullfinch staircase in the center there, and it goes spiraling all the way up to it. It's absolutely quite magnificent. But this is kind of the Beacon Hill ambiance that Henry was striving for, and as I said, they remained friends, but she rebuffed his proposal, his admonitions, and he did what I regard as one of the 2 dumbest things he ever did. The first one was to insist that his first wife, Mary, go to Europe with him because she really wasn't keen on doing that. She was a rather frail young woman, and sadly she had that miscarriage. But secondly, writing a roman à clef, a novel, a kind of a thinly disguised fictional treatment of his failed pursuit of Fanny Appleton. And she was Mary Ashburton in the book, and Henry was the Paul Fleming character. And here is how they were depicted by Burkitt Foster in the first illustrated edition of Hyperion, 1853. The book itself was published in 1839. Well, that's just made what might have been a 3 or 4 year courtship into a 7-year courtship. She didn't even speak to him for a couple of years. How they had a rapprochement, well, I discussed that in the book. Don't really have time to get into it here. But 1839 was a very interesting year. He might have been eating his heart out about not being able to win the hand of Fanny Appleton, but he was working. I mean, he wrote the Psalm of Life. You know, this is what everyone regards, all the scholars regard as what we say and call in modern publishing the breakthrough work. It was published pseudonymously, but pretty soon everyone knew who did it. It was published all over the world. It was this, and I have this to give you an idea of just how popular it was throughout the world. Here it is, painted in Mandarin Chinese on a fan, presented to him in the court of the emperor in China, and given to Henry by the ambassador, the American ambassador, the envoy at a dinner party. But it was brought home, and the Psalm of Life appeared in multiple languages. And to this day, I mean, you have lines. We talk about words and expressions that still endure in our common discourse. People don't even realize where they're coming from. But for just lines that come out of this poem: life is but an empty dream. Things are not what they seem. Footprints on the sands of time. Learn to labor and to love. And this was 1830, so that was a smash. Hyperion is 1839, and then he also writes the Village Blacksmith, and which is published the following year, but he wrote it in 1839. So he was working. He was a very industrious Yankee, and he believed in work and production. And this is the actual tree just before it was cut down to widen the street in Cambridge. He went to live in 105 Brattle Street. And this is Henry's own sketch of the chestnut tree under a spreading chestnut tree in his own hand, which was recently found, not recently, but not so long ago among the collections at Longfellow House. And it's kind of wonderful. It's the actual tree with his own lines from the poem in it. So this is 1839. But here's the letter, 1843. May 10th, 1843, And that's I won't read the whole thing. You can see the transcript on the right, and it's really probably the only love letter you will find exchanged between these two people. Only about 9 letters are extant that they exchange, and you say, how could that possibly be? Well, first of all, for the years of the courtship, they weren't really speaking what we call the courtship. That's with quotation marks around it. But they really weren't speaking. And then finally, when they were married, they were inseparable. And Henry once wrote to an admirer in England who was wondering if Henry might visit soon, and if he were to visit, would he be bringing his wife with him? And Henry said, it is a part of our theory of life to never be separated. I mean, but once they were married, it was instantaneous. And why do we spend so much time on this, especially with respect to the poetry? Not only is it a great love story, but their marriage ushers in, and this marriage embraces 18 years of uninterrupted productivity and creativity. So many of his great works are published during this period, all of the long narrative poems, many of the shorter poems, Paul Revere's Ride, The Building of the Ship, Hiawatha, Miles Standish, Evangeline, all are produced during the time of his marriage. And there she is, this one little love letter. And it was suppressed, by the way. I believe it appears in my book for the first time. I hate to say suppressed, but the Longfellow family and later generations didn't want, I guess, Victorian taste, expressing a little too much passion was just not in the books, but it's a very important letter. So the wedding present that Fanny gave her husband, Henry, on her wedding day. I regard this, by the way, as one of the great material objects. I haven't said much about materiality in my presentation here tonight, but another reason why I really wanted to do this book and was really encouraged to do it was not only because there's so much documentary material available. Did I mention 800,000, an estimated 800,000 artifactual and manuscript materials in Longfellow House, which is now owned and maintained by the National Park Service, but objects in situ. I mentioned that it is one of 2 museums devoted to Longfellow. What is truly remarkable about this one is everything in it is original to the owners. The furniture, the various the furniture and the paintings on the wall, even these objects that are stored in the basement vault. And this is an album of pictures that Fanny sketched during that time in Europe when they met. What makes it really incredible to me as a material artifact is not so much the pictures inside, which are wonderful, but look at the inscription. And she has the date there, June 13th, 1843, the day of their wedding. Mary Ashburton to Paul Fleming. You remember the names of those characters I gave you a little while back in Hyperion? Mary Ashburton was the Fanny Appleton character, and Paul Fleming was the Henry Longfellow character. And what she is saying here, in essence, she's quoting from Psalms of Life. Let the dead past bury their dead, and now we begin a new life together as husband and wife. And to me, it's one of the most remarkable artifacts. And it's so often passed over. It's not even on public view. It's down in the vault. And it just says so much when an artifact tells you so much, that even words themselves can't tell you. But so that's one wedding present. Here's another one. This is the wedding present from Nathan Appleton, the father of the bride. And this is, I call it a house for all seasons. And if you haven't, so many of our 30 libraries on hand here tonight from Massachusetts, I believe they're open again after the pandemic. Please go see it. It's just quite magnificent. It's right at 105 Brattle Street, just a half mile from Harvard Square. It's where this couple lived, where Henry lived for 50 years. And of course, he and his wife lived for 18 years. It was built in 1759, so it is colonial. And during the Revolutionary War, during the siege of Boston, it was the command headquarters for George Washington. So it had a very important historic significance and something that Henry and Fanny were ever mindful of. In fact, I think they were way ahead of their time on this because they could have actually, if Nathan Appleton had had his druthers, he would have had his daughter move up on Beacon Hill and get a beautiful home up there. This was kind of, he might have only been 100 years old, but it was aging and it needed some work, and it was old by, contemporary standards. But they just felt the historic importance of this place, and they were determined to retain its character. Fanny and Henry both said, we are going to retain the integrity of this house and true to Washington and the others that have lived. So I think they were way ahead of their time on that for historic preservation. And here's George Washington as he undoubtedly looked when he was living there at the Vassal, was formerly known as the Vassal Mansion, later known as Craigie House. And it looks a little different there because a later owner before the Longfellow was Andrew Craigie, for whom the house was known for many years, Craigie House. He added the 2 piazzas that distinguish the house now, and a few other things inside. But that's the way the house would have looked when Washington was there. And this particular photograph, not a photograph, this engraving is from an album that Henry kept. So I don't know where it originally was, but it was cut and clipped and in an album that he kept specifically for Craigie House. That's the way it looked during their lifetimes. It was in homes of American authors, so you can see it was very rural at the time. There weren't that many houses. It was a working farm area, and so she was a city girl, and here she was living across the river at this place in Cambridge. But they were very happy. And I swear I'm going to make a Christmas card with this wonderful chromolithograph from 1904. I just love it. And this was long after, not long after, but yeah, it's 10 or 15 years after Henry's death, and it was still a magnet for the literary pilgrims who came streaming to visit this house, even especially while Henry was alive, but long after his death as well. On their honeymoon, they went out, of all places, to the Springfield Arsenal, and they went in and they saw these thousands of muskets rising to the ceiling. And Fanny was emboldened to suggest a poem to Henry, and here she is writing to her mother-in-law. He has written a poem lately upon peace, which I am sure will give his mother's heart a throb of great joy and pride. But really, she had suggested this metaphor of these weapons being the devil's organ, and she wanted Henry to use that as the central image in a poem, which became the Arsenal at Springfield, and a very, very significant poem which really caused a lot of comment when it was issued in 1844. These are the only pictures that we have of Henry having made a sketch of Fanny. She's dozing, and Fanny making a sketch of Henry, and they're both 1847, and they're both in the study. And the number one activity of the day, the number one big attraction of the day, every day without fail in the evening, she read aloud to Henry. The first thing he noticed about her when he writes it in Hyperion, and he said it in his letters, was her voice, her musical voice. And she would read to him from their vast library of books every night in multiple languages, and it was the highlight of the day. And there you have it. Books, as I said, are throughout the house, even repurposed windows. As you see here, the one on the left in the study downstairs. This is in a bedroom upstairs. Most of the books are still there. A number of the really important ones that have some annotations in it and associations. They went to the Houghton Library, about 1,500 of them, but still just under 12,000 books in the Craigie House. And just briefly going through the other parts of the house, all original artifacts, paintings, furniture. This is the dining room. They were great entertainers. They liked small dinner parties, about 8 people. Charles Dickens had dinner there. You're just so many people that had dinner there. Those are the Gilbert Stuart paintings over there on the right. Those are the paintings of the 3 daughters, the famous painting of the 3 daughters that he will write about in the Children's Hour, which we'll get to in just a little bit. Here's the library. What is known as the library. And you notice the busts of Greek tragedians on top of each one kind of suggests the library of Robert Cotton, which is in England back in the Elizabethan times. Robert Cotton, the famous collector, had busts of Roman emperors on his book presses. Henry did that. And here's the study. This was George Washington's office during the siege of Boston, and it's really Henry did all of his work. And it's really retained its character so much today. as it did then. All of these things are authentic. The Eastman Johnson portraits of his friends are in there. We mentioned the children's hour. I hear in the chamber above me the patter of little feet, the patter of little feet, the sound of a door that is opened in voices soft and sweet. From my study I see in the lamplight descending the broad hall stair, grave Alice and laughing Allegra and Edith with golden hair. And these are the stairs they would come tumbling down in. Now you see that painting, which you just saw in a previous picture. That's the painting on the left. What you see there on the right is a carte de visite, kind of small, and it was housed in a little tin frame about the size, and it was found lying on the battlefield among the dead at Gettysburg. And no one knew whether it came from a Confederate soldier or a Union soldier, but some young man who just, like so many other people, looked to Longfellow for inspiration and for comfort, had worn that into battle, had died on the battlefield. And that pendant was found, and it's among the collections of the Maine Historic Society. Very moving. How important, how influential was Longfellow? That's just one little example. This is the Martha Washington study. That's where she and Martha Washington entertained people. That's where Fanny liked to sit and write. That was Fanny's desk over there in the corner. That was brought with her from Beacon Street to the house. She did a lot of writing there. Upstairs, you find George Washington represented throughout the house. And here is a poem in Henry's hand, and that's the close-up, and there it is over there on the right. Once within these walls, one who memory oft recalls, the father of his country dwelt, and that's from the poem To a Child. These are daguerreotypes taken to the family with their children. They had 5 children, 6 children, one of whom died in very young childhood, named for Fanny. Here they are with their 2 sons. I love the one on the left, if you look closely enough. Charlie was a very irascible young man, and she's holding his head firm with that right hand just to keep him straight. And there she is, her favorite activity, reading to the boys. These pictures appeared in my book for the first time. They were acquired by Bowdoin College in 2017, and they are, I believe, the last picture of Fanny taken, and the last picture of Henry taken without the beard. She dies in 1861, and these were taken just not so long before that. There are presentations from many of his famous poems in the house. This engraving of Evangeline is in the bedroom upstairs. This Hiawatha's Departure by Bierstadt is actually is in the dining room. On the back of that portrait, and if my friend Jerry Slater is watching out in Colorado, on the back of this painting is the menu from a dinner in London, and when Henry was presented with this painting, and also the menu from the dinner that they had that night. Henry pasted the menu to the back of the picture. If you remind me, I'll send you a photograph of it, and I'll show you what they had for dinner that night. Well, we all know this poem, don't we? Paul Revere's Ride. There's Henry on the stamp, and there's a illustration issued during World War II. And what I really impresses me most about this poem, when people say, well, it's about the Revolutionary War, and he gets things wrong. He didn't. He was writing a ballad, and he was talking about the here and now, and he was concerned about the impending Civil War. This was in April of 1861, right after not long before the war breaks out, and he writes. And if you look at the change of tenses, for born in the night wind of the past, through all our history to the last, in the hour of darkness and peril and need, the people will waken and listen to hear the hurrying hoofbeats of that steed and the midnight message of Paul Revere. Spectacular. Well, look at the date here, May 20th, 1861. Henry planted these lilac trees. They're still there. These are my pictures. The purple buds of the lilacs tip the hedges, and the flowery tide of spring sweeps on. Then in the very next sentence, he says the sounds of guns in the South are booming. I mean, we are in this Civil War is now underway. May 20th, 1861. Material object number 2. When I was confronted with these, I just had to sit back and pause. And these are little snippets of golden hair. Remember the daughter with the golden hair? This is Edith's golden hair. And the day Fanny met her demise, a horrible accident. She was snipping curls from her daughter, Edith and sealing them in these envelopes. There are 5 or 6 envelopes, one of which is empty. We assume the last one is empty because what happened, only the little girls, they were 5 and 6, were witnesses, but a drop of molten wax apparently dripped on Fanny's big dress, one of these big dresses that they wore, these horribly fire-prone dresses, and her dress burst into flames. She ran just terrified and hysterical. Henry was dozing in the study. He tried to put out the flames with the throw rug, and he did way too late, and she died the following morning. And whatever anguish and grief he felt after the death of his first wife was just compounded many, many times over. Of course, he had 5 children. He was now a single father. And he answered a letter to George William Curtis. He says, "To the outside world I am calm, but inwardly I am bleeding to death." And he really never forgot this woman. It really marked the rest of his life. And the reason he started to grow that beard, and he grew that beard, is he was very severely injured in the fire. He had some facial scars in his hands. His hands were burned. So what did he do in the immediate aftermath? He said, "I can't even write poetry right now." He turned to it. But he turned again to translation and to Dante. And this is arguably his very first copy of Dante, given to him during that first trip long ago to Europe by his good friend George Washington Green. And he turned to translating Dante into English, and he becomes the first American to do so. And here are my copies of the first edition of Dante's Divine Comedy, opened there to the title page of Volume 1. And Harold Bloom, the great critic, told me, among others, that he still regards this as one of the very best translations of Dante into English, because Henry believed firmly in authenticity. He said, you don't want to tell the reader what you think the writer is saying. You want to tell him what the writer is saying in words better expressed than I just did. But he writes here to Ferdinand Freiligrath, he says, "I have taken refuge in this translation of the Divine Comedy because of his loss." And if you go to Purgatorio, "Tell me Fanny is not on his mind," when he does the translation thusly, how much in my mind was I disturbed when I turned around to look on Beatrice, that her I could not see, although I was close at her side and in the happy world. Fanny is with him there. There's no question about that. And he also started recycling not recycling, but repurposing some other poems that he's done in translations, and he publishes the Tales of a Wayside Inn in 1863. The Landlord's Tale becomes, Paul Revere's Ride becomes the Landlord's Tale. There's Ole Bull playing the violin, and these were all based on real people, which is very unusual for Longfellow's poems. He didn't do that often, but in this poem, he had all of the visitors to the Wayside Inn kind of modeled on Canterbury Tales, on real people that he knew. And of course, here is the Wayside Inn, which became exceedingly well read all over the world. And here's a Currier and Ives lithograph that was basically done within a year of publication. They did 7 of these. And when during the Civil War, his older son Charlie ran away and joined the Union Army, Henry couldn't dissuade him, and the young man was wounded in battle, and he also got camp fever. And when he went down to visit Charlie once, not to visit, to be with him during his convalescence, he was staying at a hotel in Washington, D.C., and visiting with his son, nursing his son during the day. And one Sunday morning, he writes this in a letter to his other son, he was startled to wake up and to hear the church bells ringing on a Sunday morning, and also across the Potomac, he could hear the cannonade of artillery in the Civil War. And it inspired him a few months later to write Christmas Bells. And he says, "I heard the bells on Christmas Day, their old familiar carols play, and wild and sweet the words repeat, of peace on earth, goodwill to men." And this is how they deck out the house every Christmas, with those old lanterns. It's quite beautiful. It's open to the public at Christmas. Beautiful. Well, I'm going to move a little quickly now because I'm going a little long, but these are Eastman Johnson portraits of Henry's friends, all of which hang in the study. Quite beautiful. Cornelius Conway Felton, former president of Harvard, very close friend, Hawthorne, Emerson, Charles Sumner, and there's Henry and Sumner in D.C. That was when he was in Washington visiting, nursing with Charlie. it was a very Robert Frost, who loved Longfellow, and actually his very first collection of poetry uses a. I should go back there. I missed it, but he went to visit the Senate chamber, and it was a senator noticed him in the gallery and asked to pause so the senators could go up and shake his hand. That's how popular he was, and how popular was his house as a tourist attraction. This is the Sears and Roebuck model. It was called the Magnolia House, and it was modeled on the Longfellow house, and a number of them still standing in the United States. And it was for a number of years their best-selling model. And here's Longfellow in Greek. I thought I'd put it up there in a classic comic book. We talk about Longfellow, the cultural hero, and just pervading all aspects of American cultural life. I mean, these are Longfellow cigars up on the right, and there's a Longfellow Wedgwood pitcher, and there's some pictures of the Longfellow album that you could buy. It was just an amazing thing. And here's the paparazzi wouldn't stop bothering me either. This is an 1878 picture. It's a stereoscopic view, and Henry says in his journal, "There stood another photographer with his deadly instrument aimed at us." And it's it's the only picture I can think of that I've seen where he is actually seen outside of his house, and that's one of his daughters, Henry, in his study. I'm going to move a little quickly now. This is upstairs in the bedroom. Very important. You ask about the title, Cross of Snow. Do note the painting of Fanny on the wall. That's the bedroom. That's the bed where their children were born, where they lived their marriage, their private room. It's where Fanny died. It's where he would die. And of course, he had trouble sleeping. And there's the picture of there's the painting of his wife, and there is the bed. And he writes this poem. Again, another item when I ran across this. This is the holographic copy of the Cross of Snow. And again, those of you who have worked in archives, you know it's just chronological, one thing after the other, and this thing sort of pops up at you, and it's written on two sides. It's a standard classic sonnet of 14 lines, and he's done 8 lines in the front, 6 in the back. The front contemplates that portrait on the left of his wife, and the 6 lines in the back contemplates this painting that has been seen by millions of people at the Centennial Exhibition. It's called the Mountain of the Holy Cross, and it's a mountain in Colorado that had recently been discovered, and it had this image, not this image, but these fissures of snow which had the shape of a cross. And Henry writes, in the long sleepless watches of the night, a gentle face looks at me from the wall. A gentle face. I can't read it with the writing here, but I won't brutalize the poem. I just invite you to read it yourself when you have a chance. But he talks about this mountain in the distant west that, sun defining in its deep ravines, displays a cross of snow upon its side. Such is the cross I wear upon my breast these 18 years, through all the changing scenes and seasons, changeless since the day she died. And he wrote that on the 18th anniversary of her death, and they had been married for 18 years. And it was this poem, which was not published in his lifetime, but was found among his papers and published posthumously. And I thought that was the title for my book. And here's where they were all buried at Mount Auburn Cemetery. Little Fanny, they had a little daughter who died. She was named for her mother. She's there. And both of his wives are buried there. And as his brother Sam said, he had known both the suffering and the victory. He had several flowers there to designate both grief and triumph. So finally, Catherine Lee Bates writes a beautiful tribute to him. O gentle minstrel, may thy rest be deep and tranquil as thy working tide was long. Our lonely hearts will grudge thee not thy sleep, who grudged us not thy song. So there we go, and that is my presentation. I hope we have time for some questions. Stop the sharing. There we are. I'm back again. Okay. So.
All right, Nick. Wonderful presentation as expected. So, folks, if we'll take roughly 10 minutes of questions and comments. If you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A box. If you have any comments, type them into the chat. and I will do my best to relay them all to Nicholas. Let's see here. Okay, let me see here. So I apologize for any mispronunciations in advance. Chevy asks, the relationship between Hawthorne and Melville in the Berkshires is legendary. Who was Longfellow's closest lifelong friend and muse?
His closest lifelong friend, I would say, was Charles Sumner. Not lifelong, but I mean, he met him when he moved to Cambridge, but from the time he moved to Cambridge in 1829, I guess it is, until Sumner dies, they're inseparable. And Sumner, even while he's being the great abolitionist and he's having all these problems with being rejected up on Beacon Hill, he spends several nights a week when he's not in Washington. He's with Longfellow. Longfellow lets him read everything he writes. And Sumner is devoted to him and he's devoted to Sumner. So I would say number one, first among them all, would be Charles Sumner.
And follow-up question, who was the single greatest influence on Longfellow, acknowledged by Longfellow himself?
That's an interesting question. He pays tribute in a memoriam, in a memorial address that he gave. I don't know if he gave it, but he wrote it, which is published by the Massachusetts Historical Society. When Washington Irving died, he credited Irving, number one, with giving him good advice, but also for having written the sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon, which Henry used as a model for his first book, which he, Outramare, Travels Beyond the Sea, and it was kind of rather shamelessly modeled on Washington Irving. And he did say that Irving was the first great influence. But when he was doing all of his studies and his research, and he was a voracious reader, and he really was a polymath. He was so influenced by all of these literary traditions and all these other works of literature. So it's not necessarily just an individual, but I think just the literatures of the world were so influential on him. But he credits Washington Irving creatively, and he's devoted to his father, of course, as an influence. But he also keeps a lot of his thoughts pretty close to his vest. He wrote these wonderful diaries and letters, but he really so often does not let you get really inside him, and that's one of the big raps against his diaries. I think the diaries are wonderful, but I do agree they could probably be more forthcoming and revealing more of who he owed things to, so to speak.
So Jerry says, great presentation. Donnie says, thank you very much. Wonderful presentation. Lori says it was beautiful. Marilyn says, thank you. I enjoyed it very much. Beverly asks, did Longfellow have any connection to Thoreau?
They visited, but not close. He was close to Hawthorne, and he and Emerson were friendly, very good. I wouldn't say they're especially close, but you see mention of Thoreau coming over for dinner. In fact, there's a big falling out between Charles Sumner and Henry's father-in-law, Nathan Appleton. Nathan Appleton is what you call a cotton Whig. He certainly is not pro-slavery, but he's not in any rush to lose out all of the cotton shipments up for his textile mills, and that was why we call them the Cotton Whigs. And Sumner, on the other hand, is just uncompromising abolitionist. And poor Henry's in the middle, and his wife's in the middle. So there was a big falling out between the Sumner was no longer welcome at the Appleton home, and they had been friendly up prior to that. They actually, Sumner is a distant cousin of his second wife, Nathan Appleton. But in one letter, Appleton is coming over for dinner one night at Brattle Street, and he writes a letter to Sumner. He said, I don't think you should come to dinner tomorrow night for reasons that you can appreciate. Why don't you come Thursday night? Thoreau will be here. So he's kind of said, he sweetens it by saying, well, don't come tomorrow, but when you come the night after, I got Hawthorne and Thoreau, and I think Emerson. You talk about a murderer's row of a lineup of all-stars having dinner that night at the. You'd love to be a fly on the wall for that dinner, but they were. I wouldn't even go so far as to say they were friendly, but they were certainly familiar with each other.
Terry asks, when did Longfellow's reputation fade? What exactly was the critique?
Oh, I think you can see it coming in the early years of the 20th century. I mean, it didn't, this is the point, by the way. It didn't just fade. There was I point this out in my opening and my introduction. I mean, he was the target. You had the modernists and the new critics. There's no secret about it. They targeted him. I mean, he was reviled. He was literally kicked out of the literary canon. They stopped publishing him in textbooks. You didn't read him in colleges. He's starting to come back a little. He'll never regain his former stature. But there was a concerted effort to diminish him as a poet. And I'm not saying he's the greatest 19th century poet, but there's nothing wrong with being in the top 5 or 10. I mean, okay, Emily Dickinson, Walt Whitman, they are the great stars from the 19th century who really resonate in our time. But don't dismiss Longfellow. I mean, I quote a letter from Theodore Roosevelt. As this was going on, he writes a letter to a critic at the Atlantic, and he said, please, don't be so hasty. Don't dismiss Longfellow so summarily. Daniel Aaron, the late Daniel Aaron, who was the founding president of the Library of America and taught for many, many years at Harvard. He died at the age of 103 a few years ago. He said, American literature is not so rich that we can afford to dismiss a good writer like Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. There's a lot of stuff that he wrote that's dated and maybe is not doesn't really speak for today, but there are so many wonderful things that he wrote that just I think no American wrote a better sonnet than Longfellow. He wrote about 45 sonnets out of the hundreds of poems that he wrote. He really, towards the end of his life, he really turned to the sonnet. Cross of Snow is one of the sonnets, but for his Dante translation, he wrote 6 sonnets, 2 to introduce each of the parts of the Divine Comedy. They're magnificent. And you would do well to look at some of his sonnets and read some of them aloud. They're beautiful. So it was really an unfortunate situation, and I don't think it was a natural thing because he has always remained popular and decently not popular among a certain class of people, not a class but a readership, perhaps an older readership for sure. And so many of us had to memorize his poems in school. I can't tell you the number of people who have written me and said, "Oh, I love this. I love the Psalm of Life. Paul Revere's Ride, The Building of the Ship." They all have a favorite poem. And when the Library of America, by the way, was the 102nd book in their series of the American canon, so even they waited 100 books before they brought out Longfellow. It's now one of the top 10 selling books in their series. Don't hold me to the top 10, okay? I saw a statistic, but it sells very well. It sells quite decently considering they've got several hundred different authors in their backlist. Now Longfellow continues to do decently.
All right, so Nick, I have 8 questions left. I'm only going to get to 4 of them. And then you and I and the rest of the audience can watch the Olympics, okay?
Okay.
So
sure.
I'm going to ask Jackie's question first. Did Longfellow have faith in God or Christianity? So can you tell us a little bit about Longfellow's religion?
Longfellow was a Unitarian. His wife was a Unitarian. You don't find, he lost both of his wives and the second wife in such a horrific fashion. And yet you don't find him railing. You don't find him railing, God, why me, why this? You don't find any of that at all. You find a very steadfast man. You don't see him writing about his faith very often, but it was strong and it was firm, and his wife had spiritual advisors. They were very strong Unitarian beliefs, but I don't think you'll find anything more overt than that.
Jerry asks, do you think Longfellow could have used his bully pulpit to speak out more on slavery, especially since Sumner was such a great abolitionist?
Yes, he could have, but I respect what he did. You know, he did write, by the way, poems on slavery, and they were published in 1842, a full 10 years before Uncle Tom's Cabin. Even Hawthorne was aghast that he would write about. Take up the issue of slavery. Everybody had been after him. But then Sumner himself said in a letter to Francis Lieber, he said, "Do not expect war odes from Longfellow. He's not like John Greenleaf Whittier. Whittier was clearly, we all know where he stood. He wrote poetry, but Longfellow was again more of a poet of the people. And when he writes, for instance, about, I quoted Paul Revere's Ride, he's writing there about the breakup of the impending dissolution of the Union and the Civil War, but he's using the Revolutionary War as the theme, and he does this a number of times in different poems. He will be writing about issues. He'll be writing about various social issues that he's interested in, but he will not do it overtly. And I agree, he probably could have, but I don't think that would have been the Longfellow that we know. And I do say, take a look at those 7 poems on slavery that he did write. I think that they're very eloquent, and I think they speak to the horrors of slavery. And they were controversial enough that a publisher in Philadelphia refused to include them in a collection of his poetry.
All right, one viewer wants me to recite 3 lines of poetry, okay, and then ask you a question. So,
okay.
In Cross of Snow, Longfellow writes, quote, "There is a mountain in the distant west that, sun-defying in its deep ravines, displays a cross of snow upon its side." And the viewer wants to know, is Longfellow referring to a specific mountain?
Yes, and I'm sorry I wasn't more precise about that in my remarks. He's referring to a mountain has a name, the Mountain of the Holy Cross, and it had been he'd say discovered, but it was discovered by certainly Eastern Americans. I mean, the Native Americans certainly knew it, but it was out in the Colorado Rockies, and some daguerreotypes had been made of it, and Thomas Moran went out and painted it, and the painting of the Cross of the Holy Mountain won the gold medal at the Philadelphia Exposition, where Longfellow saw it, and he also saw it during a tour, and Thomas Moran wrote him and mentioned the poem. So we know that Longfellow knew that mountain, and that quite specifically is the mountain that he's referencing, which is pictured. If you recall that last image that I showed you, I showed the painting of Fanny on the wall and the other painting of that mountain with the cross. So that was an actual mountain, yes.
I'm going to read a few more comments, but let me ask you one last question. Michael asks, "Thank you for this wonderful book. Do we have a sense of Longfellow's relationship with his son in later life?"
I discuss his relationships with his children in the book. Charlie was an amazing kid, and he traveled the world. He was kind of a free spirit. He died young. I'm smiling. He did things. Everything is. Again, he ran off and joined the Union Army at the age of 17, and he went in a way that his father wouldn't even know which way he went. He had a letter posted from Maine when, in fact, he was taking the train down to Virginia. It was only because of his surname that an officer of the Union Massachusetts Cavalry recognized him and contacted him and said, "I got this Longfellow here, and he's your son. What should we do with him?" And Henry could have had him sent home because he was underage, but he said that's what the boy wants to do. He loved his children, but he was concerned with Charlie because Charlie inherited a lot of money from his mother. His mother was very wealthy. And at one point, Charlie's living in Japan, and he's traveling all over the world. He goes to Egypt, he goes to Nepal. And he's basically, Henry writes him, you basically burned through half of your inheritance. He's concerned about that. So, but he loved Charlie. That dog that you saw in that picture with Trap, that was Charlie's dog that Henry basically acquired and made his own, because Charlie was always traveling. The great story about that little dog. Henry's brother-in-law, Tom Appleton, built a yacht called the Alice, named for one of their oldest daughter. And it set a record for an Atlantic crossing for its size. And Charlie was a hand on it. He went. Tom Appleton actually had that yacht built to suit Charlie. Tom didn't sail. But the point is, when that boat left on that sailing, the little dog stowed away, and they found it halfway across, and they turned it over to another ship coming in and said, "Please bring it to Brattle Street," which he did, and they'll give you $5. But he had a nice relationship with his sons. But I think he handled it in the right way with his boys.
Excellent. Let me read a few comments to you. We'll see here. Elaine says, a book that needed writing. Thank you for your tireless research and bringing this man to a modern audience. Debbie says, thank you so much for this book. I have always loved Longfellow. Angela says, thank you very much for your writing and this presentation. I look forward to visiting the Longfellow House in Cambridge. Maureen said, I thoroughly enjoyed this program. Thank you. Lucy says, thank you. Fantastic presentation.
That's nice.
And Melissa says, thank you for this presentation and your work. I've been to his home in Portland and hope to get to the one in Cambridge. So Nicholas, do you have any last words for the group before we wrap up for the evening?
Just to thank them all really profoundly for coming out tonight and in such numbers, and to spending the evening with me and with you and with all our fellow bibliophiles and talking about someone we all clearly appreciate and love, which is Longfellow. And thank you for all of you for the wonderful, really nice words about my book and my work.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. Look for an email from me tomorrow with a recording and the feedback survey and information about some of the other upcoming author visits we have with the Massachusetts Book Award winners and honorees. So again, thank you all so much, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their night. Thanks so much, Nicholas.
Thank you, sir. Robert, hope to see you again soon. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Don't be a stranger. Bye-bye.
I won't.